The Brazilian national anthem lyrics include a line that says the country is gigante pela própria natureza, or naturally giant, and with good reason. Brazil is huge. It is larger than the continental United States and the fifth largest country in the world. Thus, not surprisingly, geography has played an important role in the development of the country. To see why, join me in this brief trip that explores the country's political geography. Unlike most of South America, Brazil has a relatively low average elevation, 320 meters or 1,050 feet compared to Argentina's 595 meters, Colombia's 593 meters, Peru's 1,555 meters, etc. That's because although there are some important mountain ranges in the country which run mostly parallel to the Atlantic coast, including the Serra do Espinhaço, Serra Gaúcha, Serra do Mar, Serra da Ibiapaba, among many others, they are about half the size of the Andes and related cordilleras. That, combined with the fact that it has an abundance of navigable rivers, from the Amazon to the São Francisco, to the Paraguay and Tocantins, goes a long way into explaining why the Portuguese Empire and later Brazilian adventurers were able to massively expand the Brazilian frontiers. That once colonial edge has translated to today's hydropower advantage, as today Brazil gets more than 3/4 of its electricity from hydropower and is the second country with the largest capacity in the world, higher than even the United States. Brazil has 6 distinct ecoregions. In terms of size, these are the Amazon Basin, a tropical rainforest that covers over a third of Brazilian territory, the Cerrado, a tropical savanna just east of the Amazon that includes what the Brazilians call Planalto Central, or the Brazilian Highland Plateau, the Mata Atlântica, or Atlantic rainforest that encompasses most of the country's Atlantic coast, the Caatinga, a semi-arid xeric shrubland centered around the northeast of the country, the Pampas, which exists at the very southern part of the country, and the Pantanal, the world's largest tropical wetlands, a grassland area that is 80% flooded for most of the year. Historically, the 3 most important of these regions have been the Atlantic rainforest, the Caatinga, and the Amazon Basin, and since the 1960s, the Cerrado has also gained importance. The Atlantic rainforest was of course the first part of Brazil the Portuguese stumbled upon when they arrived in 1500, and the area that gave the country its name as the Portuguese began to exploit a red-hued timber abundant in the region, Brazil wood. On the border of the Atlantic forest and the Cerrado, there's also the Serra do Espinhaço, an important mining area that provided gold and diamonds for the Portuguese Empire, and a series of historical towns you can still visit today, like Ouro Preto and Diamantina. This historical use has left a heavy toll in the region, however. Today, over 85% of the area has been deforested. Meanwhile, the Caatinga has historically been inhospitable and associated with what the Brazilians call the sertão, or backcountry, a sort of lawless place in the Brazilian imagination. This is in large part because of the canganceiros, social bandits that appeared in the late 19th century, famous for robbing rich landowners and providing for some of the poor people of the sertão. The canganceiros were the most powerful in the 1920s and 1930s, especially Lampião, the most famous and successful canganceiro leader, who was ambushed by police in 1938. The other reason for this view of the sertão is because of the multiple rebellions that have occurred there over the years, including the Cabanada, the Quebra-Quilos revolt, among others. The most famous of all, though, was the War of Canudos, a military action where the authorities of the newly established Brazilian Republic attacked and then razed Canudos, a settlement they saw as a threat to the regime. The danger came from the teachings of Antonio Conselheiro, a messianic-like figure that claimed the republic was sinful, the monarchy was a gift from God, and it would eventually be restored, and who had managed to attract thousands of militant followers to create what was basically a commune in the sertão. It still took 4 different offensives, but eventually Conselheiro and most of the denizens of Canudos were killed by the Brazilian military. These events were a sensation at the time, but their notoriety endured because of a Brazilian classic that is still read and discussed in Brazilian schools today, certainly in the Northeast. The work in question is Os Sertões, translated to English as Rebellion in the Backlands by Euclides da Cunha. Another area that has always loomed large in people's imagination is the Amazon Basin. The Spanish, who were the first Europeans to explore it, did so in hopes of finding El Dorado. Their search was futile, but the lure of the jungle's resources, whether land for settlers, souls to convert for missionaries, or the riverways that allowed smuggling with neighboring empires, kept the Portuguese coming and increasing the Brazilian frontiers. The real boom occurred between the 1870s and early 1910s, however, when the world's demand for rubber exploded. At the time, the Amazon Basin had a natural monopoly which created not just obscene wealth for the robber barons, but also slave-like conditions for the seringueiros, or rubber tappers, particularly indigenous people who were rounded up and forced to tap rubber as labor shortages became acute. The monopoly could not last forever, however, and it came to a sudden end when Henry Wickham, a British man living in Brazil, managed to smuggle rubber seeds out of the country. These seedlings were enough for the British to produce viable plantations in South Asia, thus ending the Amazonian rubber boom. While all of this was happening, the Cerrado saw little in the way of human activity compared to other Brazilian regions. Up until the 1960s, there was almost no agricultural production because the soil in the region is naturally infertile and cannot sustain most crops. Thus, before that time, human presence was limited to indigenous peoples, the bandeirantes who tried to enslave them, the missionaries who tried to convert them, and much later, people that lived off the mining economy that developed in places like Goiás. This all changed, however, when in 1960 Brazil inaugurated Brasilia, its new capital city, which looked to incorporate not just the Cerrado, but the rest of the north and western part of the country into the much more populated and developed east. The plan to move the capital city into the interior had been around since at least 1827, but it was only during the presidency of Juscelino Kubitschek that it became a reality. The plan overall has been a success. The city now has over 4 million people living there and has the best GDP per capita of any city in Brazil. Diverse as its vegetation and geographical landscapes are, climate is far less. If you think of Brazil as hot, it is because it is, almost everywhere, but not necessarily in the way you might think. For instance, the hottest region is not the Amazon, which rarely experiences temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but rather the Northeast. The exception to the pervasive Brazilian heat are places in higher elevations like Brasilia and Belo Horizonte, which have milder winters, and the Brazilian territory below the Tropic of Capricorn, which also tends to be cooler. Indeed, the city with the coldest average temperatures in Brazil is Urupema in Santa Catarina. Although it's still not that cold, the average low in the winter is 2.7 degrees Celsius or 36.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Politically, the country follows these natural lines only loosely. Instead, it is divided into 26 states and one federal district. They vary widely in size and population. These have roots in the original land grants, known as captaincies, that the Portuguese crown carved out, but were first consolidated in the mid-16th century to make it easier for the Europeans to administer them, and later, under an independent Brazil, were divided again as particular populations in particular places demanded their own political autonomy. This is particularly so in the Amazon Basin, where the original state of the Grão-Pará now includes 6 different states, which are Amapá, Amazonas, Acre, Para, Rondônia, and Roraima. This same process also happened in Maranhão, Mato Grosso, and Goiás, which divided their territory and added Piauí, Mato Grosso do Sul, and Tocantins respectively. The smallest state in the country, excluding the federal district, which I should note is equal to every other state and enjoys federal representation in the Senate and Chamber of Deputies, is Sergipe, a state in the northeast, with an area similar to the state of New Jersey. The largest is Amazonas, a state with an area only somewhat smaller than Alaska. Historically speaking, the 4 most important states were those of Bahia, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, and São Paulo. Bahia was the center of the Portuguese Empire and had, in Salvador, the capital of Brazil until 1763. Even after that, it has remained the most important city in the northeast, all the way to the present. Political power then moved to Rio, where the presence of the Portuguese king and then the Brazilian emperor made it flourish well into the late 19th century. Rio remained the capital until 1960, but political power then moved to Minas and Sao Paulo, as the leaders of those states dominated politics well into the 1930s. Since the dictatorship in the 1960s, however, and especially since the return of democracy in the 1980s, the federal nature of the government has shifted power away from the Atlantic states. In order to make sense of the state's different natural and cultural contexts, they are traditionally placed within 6 regions: the North, Northeast, Central, South, and Southeast. These vary dramatically in power and wealth. Although all of Brazil has seen an increased level of development since 1990, the Northeast remains the poorest region, as 8 of the 10 lowest states in the Human Development Index are all within that area. It is then followed by the North, the Center, the Southeast, and the South. Economically, the Southeast is the most important area of the country, as it contributes nearly 49% of Brazilian GDP, but it retains high levels of inequality, and thus only one of its states, Sao Paulo, is in the top 5 of the most developed index, while the rest are the Federal District and the 3 states that make up the southern region. Meanwhile, this southern region also has the lowest levels of crime, the highest levels of life expectancy, and lowest levels of inequality, and is also culturally distinct from the rest of the country, as it has the highest levels of European descendants. In comparison, the North has the largest number of indigenous people, and the Northeast the largest number of Afro-descendants. This is evident in their traditional music: Gaúcho tunes for the South, and Afro music for the Northeast, like Axé or Samba Reggae. Meanwhile, despite political and economic changes, the core of the Brazilian population remains in the Southeast, with 42% of Brazilians living there. The next region is the Northeast, with 28%. In other words, the 2 main historical areas of Portuguese settlement still account for 70% of all Brazilian people. As you might expect, this division shows up in all sorts of aspects of Brazilian life, COVID cases and deaths, for instance, in the traditional Catholicism inherited from the Portuguese versus evangelicals, who are far more likely to live in the center and west. Another example is that despite being a football-soccer mad country throughout, the top teams in Brazil are all concentrated in the south and southeast, and the national team is manned disproportionately with players from Sao Paulo, Minas, and Rio. Olympic medalists also tend to come from Sao Paulo. In 2016, when Brazil won the most medals in recent memory, a little over a third of the medalists came from that state. Even presidents have historically disproportionately come from the southeast, with only one hailing from Mato Grosso and another from Mato Grosso do Sul. The one place where this east-west division is not as noticeable is in its politics. In the early years after Brazil returned to democracy, winning candidates tended to win overwhelmingly. Even Lula, who won in 2002 after 3 tries. But since 2006, a north-south split has developed. Roughly speaking, the more leftist candidates tend to win the north, particularly the northeast, where they dominate, and those placed to the right tend to win the south, especially Sao Paulo. This is anchored around class and wealth, so it seems unlikely to change in the near future. Thus ends our trip exploring Brazilian geography. Gigante pela natureza mesmo, né? Ready to visit?